Hi, Year 7. Sorry, Year 8. I'm really sorry I'm not with you today. I am stuck isolating. So today's lesson, we are going to do a bit of a recap of diffusion, which we talked about a little bit last time I saw you. And then we will be looking at osmosis. So first of all, can you please just get the date and title written in your books? And I want you to think back to how we prepared an onion slide. So we looked at onion cells under a microscope. So can you write down 3 key points you remember about how you would prepare an onion cell slide? And your teacher can pause the video if needed while you do that. And the keywords are in the blue box as always for you to get written down. So if you'd like to pause now and get on with that. Okay, so before we go on, let's have a look at our keywords. So concentration, that kind of means the strength of something in this lesson. So if we talk about a solution that has a high concentration or a substance that has a high concentration, we mean there's a lot of it. So if you think about making yourself a glass of juice or squash, it would have a high concentration if it was really strong, and it would have a low concentration of squash if it was really weak. Gradient is like a slope or going up or down something. That's what we mean by a gradient. Cell membranes and low and high, I know you are all fine with. So to recap, diffusion is what I demonstrated to you when we dropped purple crystals into the beaker of water. So it's the movement of particles from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. In other words, they move down the slope from high to low. So we say down a concentration gradient. It doesn't happen in solids because the particles are in fixed positions. But in liquids and gases, if we have a group of particles where we've got lots of the same particles, we call that a high concentration, and the particles spread out towards the area of low concentration. Okay, so that's why we call it a concentration gradient, because it's spreading from high to low, like you might be going down a slope. And the particles will just keep moving until they're evenly spread out. And of course, actually, they're still moving after that. But you don't notice an overall movement because the particles are all now evenly spread. So we have an even concentration. So there we are, an arrow showing movement from high to low concentration. So just a reminder, that was the demonstration I showed you last time. And in the first picture, you can see at the bottom of the beaker, all the purple crystals have sunk to one place. There's a high concentration of purple crystals at the bottom of the beaker, a low concentration in the rest of the beaker. But over time, those particles spread out. They diffuse from the area of high concentration towards the area of low concentration, and that will keep going until the particles are evenly spread. These diagrams show an animal cell. The spots represent particles of a useful substance, such as oxygen or glucose, that we want to move into our cell. You can see that in the first picture, there is a high concentration of the oxygen outside of the cell, a low concentration inside. There are fewer purple dots. And because the cell is surrounded by a semi-permeable membrane, which means a membrane that lets some molecules through and not others, it'll let small things through like glucose and oxygen, but not the really big molecules like starch, for example. Those molecules will diffuse from the high concentration outside of the cell into the cell until the particles are evenly spread. And you can see that in the second picture. So it's useful because we get important stuff sorry, that was my phone, getting important stuff moving in to the cells, and stuff that we don't want in the cells, like carbon dioxide, can move out. Is really useful for living things because it doesn't need any energy, and living things need to preserve energy. This just happens because of the random motion of particles. And to get in or out of the cell, the particles move through this selectively permeable membrane, sometimes called a semi-permeable membrane. It means the same thing. It lets small molecules through, but not the larger ones. Okay, if you have this written down in your book already from last lesson, then you don't need to write it again, though I would like you to read it through. If you don't, then I would like you please to copy it from the board. Your teacher can pause the video while you try and put the correct keywords into the gaps in your book. Please write out the whole paragraph, and I'll show you the answers in a couple of minutes. Okay, we're going to look at the answers now, so pause the video if you haven't finished. There's your answers, so please just read that through. Mark the answers that you've got correct for me, and correct the ones that are incorrect. Remember, it doesn't matter if you've made mistakes as long as you learn through them. And again, I'm going to move on, so if you haven't finished, please pause. So this is a GCSE definition of diffusion. Diffusion is really important at GCSE. So I just want you to read that through and think about, if you were writing about diffusion in a GCSE question, what would be the most important bits to include? So we've got diffusion is the movement of particles from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration down a concentration gradient. So which parts of this definition would be important for getting marks at GCSE? Just read it through to yourself and think about the key phrases that are in that definition. You don't need to write this down. I'm going to show you in a few seconds which I think are the most important phrases. There we go. Hopefully you've remembered to look at your keywords list. So, movement of particles, that's really important. When we're writing or talking about diffusion, we must mention the movement of particles. It's movement from a high concentration to an area of low concentration. So you need to include that. And if you can include the key terms concentration gradient, when moving down the concentration gradient, that's even better. Okay, you've got a little task to do now. I want you, please, to, in your books or on paper, whatever you're using, to do almost like a little storyboard showing the process of diffusion. So the first boxes I've completed for you, we've got a diagram showing a high concentration of red particles compared to the blue. To start with, when we first put them together, the particles are separate. We've got two different substances there. I want you to show me with diagrams and words, please, the process that happens. So showing the particles diffusing until we have an even concentration at the end. So if you haven't got colours, you can just do little black blobs for one substance and just little circles for your other substance. So can you draw for me? Doesn't matter if you don't do as many as 4 steps. You might feel you can just draw it in 2 or 3, but a clear diagram or diagrams with some words and phrases to accompany it, describing what's happening in the process of diffusion. You'll need to pause the video now while you do that piece of work. Okay, I'm going to show you a sample answer now. So this is the sort of thing I was hoping for. So in our first picture, we've got red blobs all grouped together, blue blobs all grouped together. But over time, the red and the blue are gradually mixing. If you've used the terms diffusion, random motion, you might have said high to low concentration, or even moving down a concentration gradient. That is even better. Okay, moving on. So diffusion can happen slowly or really quickly, depending on the conditions and where it's happening. So in these examples, we've got particles moving across a thick membrane, so they've got quite a long way to travel, compared to, on the right, particles moving across a thin membrane. Diffusion will happen more quickly through a thin membrane than a thick membrane because they don't have so far to travel. So you'll generally find cell membranes will be very thin because it's easier and faster to get particles to diffuse across a thin membrane than a thick membrane. The type of membrane makes a difference, but also the difference in concentration. So on the left-hand side, the picture shows a slightly higher concentration on one side of the membrane compared to the other, whereas on the right-hand picture, we've got a much higher concentration of one particle compared to the other. And do you think diffusion will happen more quickly if there is a very high concentration or just a slightly high concentration? Well, hopefully you said a high concentration, and that would make a bigger concentration gradient, a bigger difference between the high level of concentration and the low concentration gradient. Sorry, the low level of concentration. Now in these pictures, we've got a flat cell membrane on the left-hand side picture, and then we've got a slightly folded cell membrane on the right-hand side. Now what that does is increase the surface area. Diffusion happens across cell surfaces, and the more surface we've got, the better. The quicker diffusion will happen if we've got a bigger surface area. So on the right-hand picture, we've got a larger surface area and diffusion happens more quickly. Okay, let's try some true or false. So you might want to show your teacher a true or a false, thumb up, thumb down, as we go through the answers, or you can just think these to your head as I'm not there to see you. Okay, so true or false, diffusion happens because particles in a solution constantly move. They can move in any direction, but far more particles tend to move from low concentration to high concentration than the other way. So have a think about that. Do you think it's true or false? Well, it's false. What it should say is far more particles tend to move from high concentration to low than the other way. So that one is false. Next one. True or false? The rate of diffusion can vary. So a thumb up for true, a thumb down for false. The correct answer is true. Thumbs up. It can vary. We just talked about it varying due to things like surface area or the concentration gradient. True or false? Diffusion is an example of passive transport, i.e. it doesn't require energy. So do you think that's true or false? Well, the correct answer is true. It doesn't require energy, which makes it really useful for living things. True or false? The shorter the distance the particles have to move, the lower the rate of diffusion. Okay, well that's actually false, because if there is a shorter distance, then the particles will actually diffuse more quickly. Okay, that is the end of the first part of the lesson. We will be moving on to osmosis next. So be ready as soon as the teacher tells you you're ready to start. Be ready to have your date, your books open or your paper ready to do your date, title and a new starter.